Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka nabina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and good morning Instagram fam, friends and followers of as-Saafiy, and welcome to another episode of Revert Reflections. Coming to you on a Saturday morning. Typically we give you guys Saturdays and Sundays off and give you a respite from our talks and our conversations, but I wanted to come to you today because we only had 2 sessions this past week, and because I wanted to address something that happened this past week, because I feel it's important to do so. So before digging in or diving into the issue that I wanted to address, I wanted us to remind ourselves why we're doing the current series of talks under the theme Back to Basics. So basically, there are probably 2 primary reasons for that. One of them is because something that we've noticed, or I've noticed in my conversations with different people, particularly, but not exclusively, revert Muslims, is that many of them speak about, complain of, or exhibit a weak foundation in religion, a weak foundation in faith, and acknowledge that they came into faith and things kind of moved relatively quickly. They had to continue to live and focus on life, and so the opportunity and the time they were able to dedicate to learning Islam in detail and strengthen their foundation, they just didn't have it, or they just didn't dedicate the amount of time necessary, etc. And now here they are 5 years in, 7 years in, 10 years in, or more than that, and they feel that the foundation is not where it should be, or their commitment is indicating to them that the foundation isn't where it should be. Their knowledge is indicative of the fact and some of the mistakes that they're making, etc., and so on. And also what's concerning about this particularly is that when the foundation is weak, the foundation of faith is weak, the foundation of knowledge is weak, what happens when the winds of trials and the winds of doubts and misconceptions and dubious assertions blow? That structure of Islam that we're trying to build on a weak foundation begins to sway and is under the threat of collapsing entirely. And so one of the reasons why we wanted to do the Back to Basics series was to help us all solidify our foundations. Another reason why we chose this topic is because some of us, after being Muslim for some period of time and getting into a groove as far as Islam is concerned, some of us have actually forgotten why we accepted Islam. We've become desensitized to the beauty of Islam that attracted us to it, the attractive features of Islam that drew us in and made us want to accept it and be a part of it. And so one of the reasons why we wanted to go back to basics is to revive that spirit, to help us get back that love for Islam and that appreciation for its beauty. So we started having this discussion with the believers, this discussion under the theme of back to basics. Why do we love this deen? Why should we love this deen? What are the basic, essential competencies that are required for every Muslim to have in order to be a true Muslim, a committed Muslim, etc.? And that led us to obviously a discussion of the most important and central part of the religion, which is the belief in Allah, which led us to a discussion of belief in Allah's existence, which led us to a discussion of the tools that every believer should have to mute the voices of atheism, which are constantly swarming around us in this country in which we live, which is moving away from religion and belief in God and toward atheism and agnosticism. So this leads me now to the point of me coming to you today and the incident that occurred this past week that I feel I should address. And that is that one of those talks that we had under the title of Answering Atheism invoked the ire of an atheist who proceeded to upload a lengthy rebuttal to one of the talks. And of course, in that rebuttal, because the conversation we were having was a conversation for believers. It was a conversation with believers. Of course, this atheist, when he rebutted speaking an entirely different language than the language we were speaking as believers to believers. And I'll give you an example. In the course of his rebuttal, he said that morality is irrelevant. And obviously, that is completely on a different wavelength from the wavelength that you and I speak. He's speaking a language that you and I do not understand, a language that certainly we're not using in our conversations on Back to the Basics. If a person comes to the believers and says morality is irrelevant, which means, practically speaking, that if we hear that someone has conned, defrauded an elderly woman with early onset dementia, conned her, defrauded her out of her entire life savings and left her penniless and homeless and without care. Morality is irrelevant. Those people who believe that and speak that language should shrug their shoulders. So what? Too bad for her. Should have had somebody to look out for her. When we hear about children being trafficked and sick people doing sick things to them, the people who say morality is irrelevant shrug their shoulders. The believers are not like that. The believers can't do that. We can't do that. We can't help but be heartbroken by that. Our faith requires that of us. When we hear about acts of genocide and ethnic cleansing, which are being committed all over the world by certain governments, entire nations of people being wiped off the face of the earth, when we hear about that, we can't shrug our shoulders. But these people who speak this very different language, the language of morality is irrelevant, they shrug their shoulders. It's a total different language that these people are speaking. Our language tells us that morality is the most relevant. After the belief in Allah's oneness, it's the most relevant thing. There couldn't be anything more relevant than morality. Our religion teaches us أثقل شيء في الميزان حسن الخلق. The weightiest thing on the scales on the Day of Judgment after a tawheed is good character. And so the person comes, they insert themselves in our conversation. As my mother used to say, it's an A and B conversation. See your way out. This person sought to see their way in and insert themselves into our discussion and try to force us to have a very different discussion, speaking a very different language. And that forced me in this past week to make a choice. Either to abandon my conversation with you, with the believers who I love dearly and who I want to help as best as I can help. Abandon that discussion with the people I love and the people I was originally talking to, and have a very different discussion, a very different conversation, speaking a very different language with a non-believer. Brothers and sisters, I have a choice to make, and I choose the former. I choose to continue having this conversation with you because I love you. And because we need to have these conversations. People need to be talking about these things and talking to us from a position of understanding, a position of mutual care and concern, a position of empathy. This was my original intention. I have to stick with it. Why? One, because it was my original intention. It was why I originally started this series. And two, it's more likely to bear fruit. And that matters. That matters. When we do things, we have to do things with the intention of what we're doing bearing fruit. We have to care about that. You can't have a fruitful conversation with someone who mocks you, mocks what you believe in. A person who clearly does not want to engage in an objective search for truth. I don't recommend you go back and read what this person wrote on YouTube, but just if you choose to, you're going to see what I'm talking about. The mocking tone, the patronizing tone, the supremacist attitude, and the lack of a desire to engage in an objective search for truth. I just want to make fun, belittle, and make you feel small. That's how these people operate. That doesn't make you right, because you can shout the loudest, because you can deliver the best insults. That doesn't say that you're right. In fact, it's an indication that you're wrong. It's an indication that you have doubts of your own. You're not certain. And you want to invite a discussion, hoping that the person will not respond, and that will quiet those doubts. I must be right because they didn't hit back. We're not supposed to engage in those types of discussions with people who are not interested in the truth. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala taught that to us through the example of our beloved Prophet ﷺ. At the beginning of Surah Abasa, he said, Abasa wa tawalla. He frowned and turned away, speaking about the Prophet ﷺ, who, when a blind man came to him, as Allah says, and ja'ahu al-a'ma, when a blind man came to him, a blind believer came to him, didn't realize the Prophet was engaged in a conversation with one of the chiefs of Mecca, one of the pagans, one of the disbelievers who were totally disinterested in Islam. They had great enmity and hostility in their hearts towards Islam. But the Prophet felt, if I can convince them, I'll convince many people through them because of the power and the weight and the influence that they have. So the Prophet was engaged in this conversation. Along comes a blind man asking the Prophet ﷺ about an issue related to religion. I want to learn more about my deen. Teach me, O Messenger of Allah. The Prophet ﷺ was interrupted by him, so he frowned and turned away. Abasa wa tawalla and ja'ahu al-a'ma. He frowned and turned away when the blind man came to him. Allah says, وَمَا يُدْرِيكَ لَعَلَّهُ يَزَكَّى. And what could make you aware, O Muhammad? Perhaps you would teach him something that would purify him. أَوْ يَذَّكَّرْ فَتَنْفَعُهُ الذِّكْرَى. Or he would be reminded and the reminder would benefit him. He wanted to learn. He was a believer. Why didn't you focus your attention on him? أَمَّا مَنِ اسْتَغْنَى. As for the one who arrogantly turns away. أَمَّا مَنِ اسْتَغْنَى فَمَا عَلَيْكَ أَلَّا يَزَّكَّى. There's no harm upon you, O Messenger of Allah, if he doesn't choose to follow the truth, he doesn't choose to be purified. This one, you turn your attention toward him. Okay? You turn your attention, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, He says, you turn your attention. فَأَنْتَ لَهُ تَصَدَّى. You turn your attention to him. وَمَا عَلَيْكَ أَلَّا يَزَّكَّى. There's no harm upon you if he doesn't become Muslim because he chooses not to follow the truth. He's obstinate and arrogant. وَأَمَّا مَنْ جَاءَكَ يَسْعَى. But as for the one who comes to you actively seeking the truth, seeking to learn, seeking to believe, seeking to submit to his Lord, فَأَنْتَ عَنْهُ تَلَهَّى. كَلَّا. He is the one you turn away from. Kalla, it shouldn't be this way. Allah is teaching us, brothers and sisters, teaching me that I need to focus my attention on you. And so we say to the atheist and all the other atheists out there who their ire is going to be invoked by what we're going to say in the coming days, teaching the believers how to mute the voices of atheism that are all around them, we say to them, sorry, we won't pardon the interruption. We won't be interrupted. We won't be daunted. We won't be turned back. We're going to keep on talking to the believers whether you like it or not, and you can say what you want to say. We can have that conversation, but not right now. Right now we're having this conversation. We're talking to the believers and helping the believers become strong and have their faith solidified against the falsity of the people who deny, against the falsity of the deniers of God. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.